Hi, everyone, and welcome to Data Engineers Lunch number 42, also streaming on YouTube Live. So for anyone watching there, welcome. Today, Arpan Patel, one of the software engineers here at Anant, will be presenting on Databricks. He'll be giving us an introduction to Databricks and more to come later this month in relation to Databricks. Your organizers for this event are Raul Singh, Arpan, and myself. And we are always looking for new members, sponsors, and speakers. So if you or someone you know would be interested in presenting in anything related to data engineering, please reach out to one of us. Our emails are listed below. Myself or Arpan, probably your best bet as far as having the most time available to respond. So definitely start with us and reach out. We are a part of a larger community. Data Community DC is an inclusive organization, so we support everyone regardless of race, gender, sexual orientation. Everyone's welcome here, and we expect respect to be given to those communities. And you can find out more about Data Community DC at their blog, as well as upcoming events that they have. The links are listed there. And what we cover here is everything related to data engineering. So could be ETL, storage systems and sources, analytics. So really there's no limit to what we're willing to talk about here in regards to data. At this point, if anyone is new and feels comfortable sharing their camera and unmuting themselves and introducing themselves and maybe talking a little bit about what they do with data, feel free to say hi. I will not pull any teeth. So if no one's feeling like sharing, we can move on. Group rules. If you have a question, ask it, be polite and courteous to others, and share what you know. This is meant to be a discussion. Arpan will establish kind of how he would like questions to be asked when he takes over. Sometimes people like to put stuff in the chat, or some people are fine with unmuting and just asking. So we'll defer to him. Here at Anant, we work with real-time data platforms. And we help our clients. Oh, hi, Chubba, did you want to introduce yourself? Sorry if I mispronounced your name. I can't hear you if you're speaking. I don't see anything in the chat, so I'm going to move on. We are partnered with DataStax as well. More on that when we are announcing upcoming events. We have been doing a workshop series with them every Tuesday at noon, but we'll discuss that later in the intro. George Washington University also a sponsor, and some of the other program sponsors. You could also have your company listed here and advertised if you want to contribute to these webinars, and some of the organizational sponsors to Data Community DC. 15-second announcements. If anyone has any jobs, meetups, or hackathons that they would like to promote here, you can take this as an opportunity to do so. Move on. One of our own announcements, Anant is hiring full or part-time positions for data platform operators, engineers, and architects. You can find out more at careers.anant.us. And these are 100% remote or can be 100% remote, again, full-time or part-time. So definitely check out that link. And some upcoming events. As mentioned before, we have True Cloud Transformation. This is occurring tomorrow. This is in partnership with DataStax. You can get the link at anant.us/events. It will be streamed live on YouTube, similar to this. And then upcoming data engineers lunch topics will be deploy Cassandra using DSE operator to Kubernetes, as well as we're going to have a guest speaker presenting on Bodo AI and what the capabilities there are. Also should mention that the sister lunch to this, Cassandra lunch, takes place every Wednesday, same time, same place. Well, different link, but you can check out anant.us/events to get caught up on all of our upcoming events. And that is all I have for the intro. So with that, I will pass it off to Arpan.
All righty. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Let me go ahead and share my screen. All right. Can you guys see the slide deck?
Yeah.
Alrighty, great. As Josh mentioned earlier, I don't necessarily have a preference regarding questions or additional things you want to add to what I'm talking about. If you have familiarity with something, you want to add on to something, feel free to unmute yourself and speak up. But if you do have a question, you can drop it in the chat, or you can speak up and ask it. If you're watching this on YouTube, you can drop it in the live chat, and someone is monitoring the YouTube live chat, so they'll bring it over to here on Zoom. So yeah, today's topic is going to be an introduction to Databricks and how it can be used for something like data engineering. So Databricks is a pretty extensive tool in terms of machine learning, data science, data engineering. So we'll only be focusing on some stuff that like an introductory level to get you, if you're not familiar with Databricks, to see how you can create a cluster, how you can create a database or create some tables, create a notebook. So one of the things about Databricks is it's more notebook driven. So that's why it kind of falls into the realm of like data science and machine learning. So just some basic introductory information. It's one unified platform for data and AI built on Lakehouse architecture. So Lakehouse architecture is their way of managing storage of data, ingress, egress, etc. And they also offer a free community edition, which we'll be using today in the demo portion. So it's very easy to get started and just get your hands dirty with Databricks without having to put in a credit card. And with Databricks, you could have reliable data engineering, SQL analytics on all of your data. So whether you're a business analyst, data scientist, or data engineer, it's pretty user friendly. And if you have the skills, it can be something you can leverage. It also provides for, again, collaborative data science. So if you're in an organization that has multiple teams, or multiple team members on your data science team, et cetera. And it could be used collaboratively within separate or collaborative workspaces. And because it's a fully managed cloud service, it comes with that security, reliability, scaling, and performance you expect with a cloud native option. With Databricks, you can I believe it's relatively cloud agnostic. There are documentations for how to do it with AWS, GCP, and Azure. So if you're locked into one of the clouds, you can find their documentation specific for that cloud platform. And it's rooted in open source, right? So the people who started Databricks are people who originally created Apache Spark, Delta Lakes, MLflow, et cetera. So the base, what we're focusing on in terms of the aspects of data engineering is a lot surrounding Spark. Spark is a utility tool for almost every data engineer. And so Databricks makes it easy to have a cloud version of Spark and work on necessarily, or not necessarily like local data, but if you have your databases spun up in different clusters or sorry, different clouds, you can consolidate and do your data engineering via a notebook style. So instead of having to deploy your Spark cluster, manage your Spark cluster that way, have assembled jars. This way you could do it, and you can also schedule, and we'll talk about that in a second once we get to the UI portion of how Databricks could be useful if your company's already using it. There is something that I want to mention that was new to me. I think it recently came out, because I don't remember looking at it last time, but there is a cool little tool that if you pay for Databricks, it might be useful for you and your data engineering team. So some other technologies that Databricks has native access to are like TensorFlow, Redash, R, and also Koalas, I believe. And I think that may be more recent, but you are able to use Koalas, especially if you're using more data science, machine learning aspects of Databricks. So one of the things I wanted to cover, at least that was new to me, and hopefully maybe potentially new to you, are the Delta Live tables. And it currently is in public preview. That essentially means anyone can have access to it as long as you are paying for Databricks. And essentially, it's a framework for building reliable, maintainable, and testable data processing pipelines. So again, that kind of comes into what data engineering is about, right? The ETL processes, data cleaning, data transformations, data movement. And so with data or Delta Live tables, unfortunately, because we're using the community edition of Databricks, we won't be able to necessarily test this out and show it to you guys. But if your company or you already, as an individual, already pay for Databricks, I definitely recommend testing it out. But we'll look at the documentation in a second to see how potentially you can see and build workflows. And there's some things in there that are pretty cool, and they look like something we've talked about on Data Engineers Lunch, and we'll take a look at that in a second. And so you can define the transformations on your data, and these live tables manage the task orchestration, cluster management, monitoring, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can manage how your data is transferred. So like a DAG, right? How Spark has their DAGs and tasks are broken out. You could potentially have different transformations for each step of your process. And then you can also enforce data quality, which is important for data engineering, right? So a lot of data that we're touching as data engineers ends up in the hands of business analysts or data scientists. And we need to make sure that data is useful to them. So we can enforce data quality using these Delta Live tables, and you can have expectations that have an expected data quality, and then having error handling if records fail to meet the expectations you had set. And so, as mentioned regarding the community version, the way you create and run Delta Live tables can be done with the Databricks notebook. However, generally they're done through jobs. And because once we get to the UI portion, the jobs portion of the UI is locked because we're in community. But so there's this example that I'll pull up in a second, but just to give you a quick breakdown of what it does is essentially it's a pipeline for reading JSON clickstream data into a table, into a Databricks table, and then you're reading those tables, and you have expectations and creating new tables based on the clean data, and then using those records to create new data sets. So again, kind of that data cleaning, data preparation aspects of data engineering. But I'll go ahead and open this in a new tab. Let me know if I need to zoom in a bit, but essentially, I'll just scroll through. This will be available once the slide deck is attached to the YouTube video, but also our blog and SlideShare in general. But they give you like the example Python, or if you want to do it in SQL, you can do it as well there. And so when you create this pipeline, you essentially name your pipeline, you have the libraries you need. So the nice thing about Databricks is you can manually click and find, search either, or you can put in jars themselves, and we'll take a look at that once we get to the UI portion. But essentially you could have modes, right? So there's a trigger and a continuous, right? So if you have continuous data engineering cycles, and you could have cluster configurations of how many workers and max workers to split up the work that you need. But again, this is a paid feature, so it may affect if your company's already using Databricks, you might have a budget for it. So keep that in mind. But when you're looking at these pipelines, you're able to track the flow progress, right? So similar to something we've covered, as mentioned, where we have Airflow, right? Airflow is an orchestrator, right? So within Databricks, you're able to create orchestrations of continuous or ad hoc jobs. So you can check statuses of your tables or your processes that are running. You can see your results, and then you can also see the graph of your tasks. So again, that's something like Airflow, where you can see the designation of how your graph is working when you look at the graph view in Airflow, but then you have the pipeline graph in the Databricks version. And then you can also drill down and click on schemas, information relating to each specific task in the graph. And then you can also see additional processing details. So this was something cool that I just saw for the first time. So I just wanted to share with you guys. If anyone has used it before and wants to talk about it, feel free. But yeah, I just wanted to share this with you guys. So if you guys are using Databricks, but you don't know about the live tables, hopefully that was helpful. But at this point, we can go ahead and, what happened here? Go ahead and move on to the demo portion. So the demo portion, we'll kind of just walk through the UI in case if someone hasn't used Databricks before. We'll show you how to create a cluster. Granted, it does take some time. It's not as fast as Astra, but I've already spun up one ahead of time, but we'll still go through the steps of doing it. We'll create a notebook. We'll create a table using the notebook. We could do it via Python or SQL within the same notebook, and I'll show you how to do that with multi-languages within one notebook. We'll also query the table, and then we'll go to like display the data, visualize it. So if you're a business analyst, you can even, or if you have business analysts on your team, you can even export the data and give it to them that way after running your SQL or whatever query. So yeah, let's take a look at the Databricks Community Edition. So this is the base UI once you log into Databricks Community Edition, at least. So there are some ways where you can quickly get started, right? There's a quick start tutorial where they'll show you how to do some of this as well. So like spin up a cluster, run queries, etc. within 5 minutes. It might take a little bit longer just because it might take longer to spin up the cluster. And then you can also import and explore data, and we'll take a look at that in a second. And then also we can create notebooks. So just going down through the menu options. So we're pinned on the data science, data engineering, which is pretty cool, where it's like, I don't think this was here before the last time we talked about Databricks, but we can specify which thing we want to focus on. So for right now, we're just focusing on data science and engineering. So if this is your first time logging into Databricks and you need to create a cluster, you can go down to the compute section. So the compute section is where all the information regarding your clusters happen. So if you have multiple clusters, some are terminated, some are restarting, some are started, you'll be able to see those here. But essentially, to create a new cluster, we can hit create cluster. And so you can name your cluster whatever you want, and then you can pick your runtime version. So essentially, this is where you pick essentially the version of Spark you want. So for us, I think the one I have spun up right now is using 7.3 LTS. So that just means long-term support. But the specifics of this specific runtime that we have on the running cluster is Scala 2.12 and Spark 3.0. If you want to go to an older version, you can. They have extended supports for Sparks 2.x, etc. And there's also ML versions, and you can read more about those in the documentation. But one other thing I wanted to show you guys is that when you're setting up your cluster for the first time, if you go into the availability zones, you can select that there, but the Spark thing. So if you're using Spark configs or environmental variables, you can set them here within the Spark config. So you would have, as shown here, right? So example would be Spark.speculation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can also have environment variables that your notebooks can then pull in to the individual notebooks. So the nice thing about the notebooks is they're not pinned to one cluster, right? So when you have a notebook, you can attach and detach from multiple clusters, right? So say if I have two clusters running, I have one notebook. I can attach it to the first cluster, run the notebook, and then detach it and attach it to the second one and run the notebook again. So just some variability in what you can do with multiple clusters and multiple notebooks, et cetera. So going back to our compute, and if you want to see your metrics and more information about it, however, one thing I do want to mention is if you need to update your config or you need to update your environmental variables, generally from what I experienced was that you would need to update it and then you would need to restart your cluster. But again, it's a simple process. It's just a click of a button with the restart. And then you can also have additional information, whereas you can have your JDBC URL. So that was something pretty cool. I think I don't remember seeing that last time, but I think that was a new addition, at least since the last time we covered Databricks. But going to the libraries section, so this is where we talked about like our jar packages, right? With Spark, we need packages to talk to certain stuff, right? So like we have connectors to talk to Kafka, we have connectors to talk to Cassandra, we have connectors, or we have jars to do Avro transformations, etc. That aren't native to the Spark core, right? So if we need to download something as we would do in a normal Spark interface, right? So we would need to download the package, run the Spark cluster with the package, or assemble it and then essentially send the jar through. You would essentially go to the libraries and then you would hit install new. So there are a couple different ways you can do it, right? You can upload a jar straight away, Python egg or Python WHL. I'm not sure what WHL is, but my familiarity is more with jars. But you can also pull in from the DBFS or S3. So the DBFS you can access within the drag and drop. You can do it in the data portion of the menu, and we can take a look at that later. But we also covered that in the previous Databricks introduction. And then you can also pull in packages using Python package, Maven. So Maven's generally one I use. So within Maven, we can search for stuff. So something that I use on a regular basis, because at Anant, we mainly focus on Cassandra, Spark, and Kafka. One of the big ones is the DataStax Spark connector, right? And so if we look for just Cassandra right away, we can see that there's a couple different versions that are available, but the one we're focusing on is the DataStax one. And then within there, depending on the runtime version you selected for your cluster, you would need to match that up with the compatibility of the releases of the connector, right? So if you're running an older version or a newer version of your Spark cluster, so if you're running Spark 3.0 versus Spark 3.1, there might be compatibility issues with your packages. And so it would be ideal that you would have like at least the GitHub repo where you have all the library listings and there are some indications of which ones are compatible and which ones are not. So that's just something I would recommend when you're starting to actually use Databricks, is to make sure all your compatibilities are right. Starting with probably your cluster. So based off, you have some code, some Spark code that you're porting into Databricks, make sure it's compatible there. So if you have some 2.x that you're putting into Databricks, does it work with 3.x, or do you need to spin up a runtime of 2.x, etc.? But so those are just some of the things that we could do per cluster. And then we have event logs, we have the Spark UI, and we'll take a look at this per the notebook, because we can also access the UI via the notebook. But here we can do it per cluster as well. So we can see, I think we can pop it out as well, but we won't do that just to save some time, but also driver logs, metrics, apps, etc. And then for here, we can see the master. But now what we can cover is creating a notebook. So we can hit create, and then we can either create directly a notebook, table, or cluster, but we'll create the table via the notebook, but then we'll also take a look at how to create tables otherwise. So we'll start with the notebook. We'll name it test2, since I already have a test notebook. And then default language, I'll just keep it as Python, but I'll show you again, as I mentioned, we can use multi-languages within the notebook. So no matter what default language you use, it's a very simple method just to enable multi-languages. So we'll just go with Python for now. And then again, remember how I mentioned attach and detach. For now, we're just collecting the one we have. But again, we can attach and detach one notebook to multiple clusters. Not at the same time, but in order. But essentially what we're going to do here is we're going to start by, taking a CSV and loading that as a table in our Databricks instance. So what we're going to do is run an SQL statement that says drop table if exists diamonds. So we're creating a table called diamonds, and we're creating it using CSV options, and we have some path that Databricks, one of the tutorials, already offers us. So we'll just go ahead and port it. But essentially, if I try running this, it's going to fail. And you might wonder why that happened, right? And so if you remember, we set the default language as Python, right? But this is an SQL statement. So if we want to run in SQL, Scala, or any language other than the default, we would need to have an indicator that says we're using this language. And so all you need to do is have the percent symbol and then whatever language you're using, right? So for us, it would be SQL. And so now you see that once we added SQL, the syntax lit up and says okay, so use these identifiers. So like the drop tables or the create tables using options, etc. So when we run this now, it should work. And so instead of, if you don't want to manually hit this play button every time, you can hit Shift Enter on an individual cell, and that will, sorry, and that will run the cell as well. So if we click on the Spark job here, and we want to see the job, and we hit View, we can get the Spark UI as mentioned within the notebook itself. So if we want to drill down and see individual cell level operations, how is that impacting our cluster? If we want to see specific metrics for that, we can. So we see stages, storage, environment, executors, SQL, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We're not using structured streaming, but that's an option available to us. So now what we're going to do is, if we look at the data portion of our instance, we have this table here, right? And so our default database is called default. When you spin up a cluster, I believe that is the default. But essentially, we have this table. And so if we click on it, we can see the schema that we imported in, and we can see some sample data that's available to us, and it'll truncate up to 1,000, the first 1,000 rows. And then if you're running live processing and if you need to refresh, you can. But what I wanted to show you is, if you wanted to create a table outside of doing it this method, there are ways to do it, right? So we can upload a file, and that could be like a CSV file, and that would put it into this table section. So if we drag and dropped a CSV into here, we would be able to see it after defining the targeted path. So this DBFS is essentially this section here, well, that's at least where you'll be able to see it once it happens. And then you'll be able to access it. So if you say test.csv, right? You may or may not need this .csv, I forget, but essentially is when you're trying to access it within your notebook, this is the path you would use. But you can also use S3, so you can create it with the UI, you can create it in the notebook. You can do it from like manually collecting something. So here is one way. So this is a Delta table I created earlier. And so we'll show you how to do this with the notebook itself using a Python method. But this is another way where we can create a table. So this Delta-like method is essentially Parquet files plus a transaction log. So instead of it being like a CSV file that we imported using that SQL format, this is a Parquet file that we can pull from, and we'll take a look at that in a second. But essentially we have temp, we have the user as well, other data sources. So if you want to use a different connector to upload your data, one thing I noticed, this was new to me, is that they have a Cassandra. Again, as mentioned, Anant, we focus on Cassandra, Spark, Kafka. So I'll be trying this out for the upcoming Cassandra launch I have later in the month for Databricks and Cassandra. But when you click on something like this, and when you hit create table in the notebook, it'll give you a templated version of the steps, so you can import or put in your own specifics for how to import. So with this Cassandra, I'm pretty sure it's for deployed instances, whether they be in like AWS or whatever cloud native service, or local if you have a URL. I'll see if I can do it with a local instance, if I can pull it from 127.0.1, but we'll find out later in the month. But essentially you can pull from Kafka, which is pretty cool. So if you're using Databricks as one part of your ETL processes, and you take Kafka, put it into Databricks, run some transformations, and then use Kafka to potentially pull it back out at a later step. That could potentially be a use case. And then there's also some partner integrations where you could use an ETL tool like Stitch, stream sets. I'm not as familiar with the other ones, but I know that these are some ETL tools that you could also use. So moving back to our notebook, and if we go into there's a couple ways you can access your notebook. You can do it via your workspace. So these are all different notebooks I've had either currently or in the past, and they're auto saved, so you don't have to manually save anything. Or you can go to the recent, and we'll just go on test 2. So here is coming back to what I mentioned about the Delta table, not the Delta live table as we talked about earlier, because again, that's a jobs thing, but this is just a Delta table. So we would, it's like the Delta Lake format. So it'd be like the Parquet file plus the transition log that we saw. So as mentioned, because our default language is already Python, we don't necessarily need this, but we can have it if we do need it. So if we run this, we're going to save a table and we see the Spark jobs, right? And we see some more information. This already exists. So if I go into data and we go, sorry, go to create table, other data sources, DBFS, mount, delta, diamonds. I would need to drop it. So I have a way to drop it, but I'm just going to skip over this method. But this is another way to create it. But we'll go through the code. I have a notebook to delete stuff out of like temp and delta as needed. Actually, I could probably pull that up right now. Yeah, we got some time. So let me see if this is still valid. Let's go to workspace. I think it's this one. Yeah, so what I'm going to do is get that file path. So let's go to data, DBFS, mount, delta, diamonds. So I'm just going to copy this. Actually, I might be able to just remove the entire folder. I'll see what happens. So let's go back to this remove one. And so the file location, I'm just going to switch it out. And let's see if this will work. Oh, so this is, again, this notebook's not attached to anything. So what we can do is hit attach and run. And so it's going to attach itself automatically to demo because that's the only one we currently have. So if we go back to data and we go back to our DBFS, let's see if our diamonds is still there, and it's deleted the Parquet file, which is at least, I think, all we need. So if we go back to our workspace and go back to test 2, I think if we run this, it may, I'll just name it diamonds 2, just to make it work. Okay, so we see the Spark jobs. We can see as they're progressing, we can see the schema that's being used. Because again, this is a Parquet file versus this, which is just a CSV. But moving on from this, we can also create a table using this mounted version because we're using a different thing. Sorry, we saved it as diamonds 2. We're going to create a new table called diamonds 2. So that way we'll have 2 tables. So this is SQL, right? So I need the identifier. Now if we run it, okay. So if we go back to data, looks like we dropped diamonds 1. So I'm going to go ahead and create diamonds 1 again. And now we have diamonds 1, well, quote unquote diamonds 1, diamonds 2. There is a question in the chat. Can we also document based databases, NoSQL Databricks. Let's see. So do you mean like work with document-based databases, like or work with NoSQL databases with Databricks? Is that is that what you're asking, Sergey? Okay. Yes. So we've used Databricks in the past to talk to Cassandra in the form of Databricks. So because the underlying no, you're fine. With the underlying technology of Databricks is Spark, right? So pretty much the ideal concept is if you can talk with it with Spark, you should be able to talk with it with Databricks, right? It just might change in terms of how you're able to access the data. As long as you're able to talk to it, import it, you don't need to store your data into a table, right? I can have a Databricks notebook that directly talks to something without storing it, right? So what I'll do here is, given that you've asked this question, I'll pull up an old notebook I have, and we'll revisit it in the later Cassandra launch. But so what I did with this old Cassandra example was that, oh no, so this is a different one. So this is the Cassandra setup that, as I mentioned, when you try to import using Cassandra, this is the way you could do it, right? So this is if you're importing data from Cassandra, but if you're just talking to Cassandra, again, it's just Spark get conf, like the Cassandra connection host, right? So whatever your IP is. And then you can run your DFs, right? So you can do run Spark read, map the table, map the key space, and then you pull in your data. This is an example, but as long as you're able to provide connection, sorry, not connect. As long as you're able to provide like hosts and ports, I believe outside of Cassandra, I can't necessarily speak to something like Mongo or other potential NoSQL or document-based databases, but I know at the very least, we can talk to Cassandra using Databricks without having to necessarily bring or store the data into a DBFS within Databricks. So let me see if I can pull this up. I might have it in here somewhere. It may have gotten deleted. Okay, so here it is, right? So this is an old notebook that's also stored the results, right? So what I've done here is I've pulled in, or I essentially ported Spark code that got assembled, and I ported it into the notebook, right? So this is, we're doing imports. We're pulling in conf that we set in the cluster. Again, we have Spark SQL. So what we're doing here is we're saying show tables, right? So we're not actually storing data from Cassandra, but we're directly able to talk to it, right? In the version of DataStax Astra, which I think this example uses. So what we're doing here, right? So we pull Spark, so we do a select statement using Spark SQL on our Astra instance that's in the cloud. And then I think the only thing about that is we had to import our auth packet, so essentially our connection bundle, and put that into DBFS. So that way it's kind of like when you set files on a Spark submit, right? You put it onto the node so it's able to use it. So it's a similar process, right? So we're able to read Spark and then write or read Cassandra using Spark, do some transformations, right? With some explodes, group by, right? And then we were also able to write to that Cassandra instance using Databricks. So this is just one example, a very small example, but we'll cover a little bit more in depth in the Cassandra lunch later this month about Databricks and Cassandra. But if you're interested in this very specific example, you can find it on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/AnantCorp. And if you search for Databricks, there's a Databricks and Astra webinar that we did about a year ago, and it'll show you how we set this up and run it. But if we go into back to our original notebook. Oh, hey, Rahul, do you want to say something?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hey, sorry, I don't know if you guys could hear me or not. Oh, okay. What I wanted to add to that was the Databricks is value proposition is what Arpan mentioned at the very beginning, that it's what's called a lakehouse architecture versus like a data warehouse. And so what that means is that recently, at least, they're not just like a commercialized version of Spark. Yes, it does that. They want you to use their DBFS, which is basically a wrapper around whatever native distributed file system. So on Amazon, it's S3. On Google, it's GFS. On Azure, it's Azure Data Lake. That's what they want you to use. And so that's what Arpan is demonstrating, is how to use the Delta tables on Databricks. However, Spark is not just that, right? Spark is everything in the Spark ecosystem, and Spark can talk to any database. That's what I wanted to say, was that it's not just Cassandra. Like, if there's a Spark connector, and you can install the package on the cluster using Maven or pip or wheel, whatever, then it'll work. The question is, what are you trying to do? So with Databricks, generally what people do is they create this lakehouse, right? This lakehouse meaning they dump data into these Delta tables, or they dump it into CSV or JSON or whatever, it doesn't matter. They dump it all into this big hard drive, S3, GFS, all wrapped by DBFS. And then they use Spark to do analytics on top of it. But it doesn't stop you from talking to another database. What I think people misunderstand about Databricks is, just because you have a database represented via JDBC, in a Delta table, they think that they can do transactions on top of it. And that's not what Databricks is for. Databricks is for having tons and tons of information and doing processing on it and using it like a data warehouse, but they call it a lakehouse. Where people would talk to other databases could be from ETL. So get data from Mongo or DynamoDB and do some stuff with it and then store it in Databricks or store it back. Or it could be they take a lot of information from various databases, they process it in Delta tables, and when it's ready to go, they then push it back to other databases like DynamoDB, Cassandra, whatever. I think that's what I wanted to add on to yours, Arpan, was that what Databricks is selling versus what it's capable of doing sometimes seems like two different things.
Yeah, and I think that's a good distinction to have, because if you're introducing Databricks to your company, right, you don't want to, one as a transaction would be, I think, a lot heavier in terms of pricing. So if the capabilities, you want to make sure you're using it for the right processes, right? Because Databricks can get expensive, at least at an enterprise level, I believe. And so depending on your functionality, it may or may not be the right tool, right? You might be better off just using Spark on its own to do some processes versus doing everything in Databricks. So if you are looking to introduce Databricks to your company, make sure you have the right use case, I think, is the biggest thing. And does it make sense for your company, right? Or as an individual, if you are at least like C-level, or you can make those decisions. But moving back to the last part of the demo that I wanted to cover is at least where we can connect as a data engineer. We've done some very basic stuff, but this is how we can give data back to potentially like a data or a business analyst, right? So we have another SQL statement where it's just, we get some return data, right? So we're just going to get the average price and color as price from diamonds 1 or diamonds 2, whichever one, because we created the two tables, right? And then we have it ordered. And so what we can do here is we can export it, or we can also display it and then like take a screenshot or whatever, or download the visual representation also as a PNG, right? So it's like, if you run a complex query on the data, either in your DBFS or your connected database or data source. You're able to query it, then chart it. So there's a bunch of different plot options, right? So this is just specifically for this bar chart, right? So we can pick what columns we want as keys. Do we want to group certain things? What are the values? Grouped, stacked, etc. And then display type. So essentially we can pick what we want, right? So there's a bunch of different visual representations that we could have. Quantile, scatter, histogram, map, box plot, line, QQ plot, area, pivot, pie. And then there are some legacy charts, but I think it's a well-rounded tool for an applicable use case because Databricks can get expensive, right? So it's doesn't make sense for you and your company to use it. But if you want to play around with it, knock yourself out, right? There's a community edition. You can't necessarily test everything, but you might be able to talk to Databricks to get a free trial. But I think those are the main things I wanted to cover today. And I will open up the floor to questions, or if someone wants to add something, please feel free. Yeah, you either speak up or drop it in the chat. Or if you're watching on YouTube, you can drop it in the live chat there, and someone will port it over to here as well. All right, looks like there's no questions. Thank you everyone for coming out today. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe. And Josh, would you like to close it out, or should I?
You can close out. Thanks for the presentation. It was really good demo too. I think you went into a lot of different features there. And yeah, thank you for everyone for joining us here today. Don't forget Cassandra Lunch coming up this Wednesday, and actually even sooner than that on YouTube Live. You can get the link on our events page. We are doing the final installment of our workshop with DataStax. Raul Singh himself will be speaking there, so you definitely don't want to miss that. Be covering true cloud transformation. So some of the technologies involved in completely making your transition to the cloud. And that's it for me. Thanks again, everyone, for joining. Oh, it looks like we actually did have a question on YouTube. He's beginning with, so we have Durga Prasad. He's beginning with data engineering and wants to know if you have any advice. Apologizes for an off-topic question.
No, that's fine. First things first, you could get started with our data engineering playlist on YouTube. that will keep you busy for some time and get you introduced to a bunch of different topics, right? So this was what data engineers lunch 42. So there are 41 data engineers lunches that you can start with. So I think with the very first one, we talked about the different pathways, right? All the different things that data engineering can encompass, all the different technologies, all the different databases, all the different ETL tools. And yeah, so that's a great starting point if you want to check out that first video in Data Engineers Lunch. And then you can watch the following Data Engineers Lunches. Maybe you could start with topics that you like, that you want to learn more about. Or if you want to pick up something and then you want to give a talk about it on Data Engineers Lunch, feel free to reach out to myself or Josh. Josh can drop the emails in the YouTube chat so you can have them. But yeah, that goes for anyone on the call today as well. If you are interested in learning something, or if you already use something and you want to talk about it, this is a community, right? So it's a way for you to build your public speaking, build your own knowledge, right? So if you want to learn something like Airflow, or if you want to learn something like Databricks, if you want to learn something like GKE, and then you want to talk about it on Data Engineers Lunch, feel free to reach out to Josh or myself. The emails are in the chat. And If there are no other questions, we can wrap it up and give everyone 5 minutes of their day back.
Thanks.
And in response to the Zoom link, it is different for Cassandra Lunch, but Anant.us/events has our latest events posted. You can, and there are links there as well, so you can follow there and sign up on Eventbrite as well. Awesome, we'll see you there. And Arpan, I don't know if you can see if you're logged into the YouTube. Durga Prasad, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, says this channel is a great resource. When I found this channel and saw the playlist, I was happy because there are very few resources, and he wants to thank everyone who is responsible for making all this happen. So thank you. Appreciate you tuning in and joining us on YouTube Live as well.